The man's voice hit the room like a thrown axe.
I need a housekeeper, someone who can cook, tend the animals, and look after a child. I'm leaving day after tomorrow. You want the job or not?
Every head in Millard's feed and dry goods turned. The woman behind the counter didn't flinch. She set down the tin of lard she'd been pricing, looked up at the man blocking her doorway, and said, "What happened to the last one?" The silence that followed told her more than his answer did. His name was Stellan Vore.
She'd heard of him the way you hear about a storm before it reaches you, in pieces through other people's mouths. Ran a cattle operation up in the Asher Ridge country, 3 hours north by wagon, kept mostly to himself. His wife had died 2 winters back.
Left him with a daughter, 7 years old, who apparently hadn't spoken a full sentence to anyone outside the family since the funeral. Stellan Vore was not a man who smiled easily. He was large in the way of men who've spent years doing work that grinds other men down, and his face had the look of someone who'd made a decision a long time ago not to waste expression on things that didn't deserve it.
He was maybe 40, maybe less. Hard to tell.
He said the last housekeeper had left in October because the isolation got to her. The one before that had lasted 3 weeks. He didn't say it like a confession. He said it like a man reading off the weather. The woman behind the counter was Della Foss.
28 years old.
Proprietor of Millard's for going on 4 years now, ever since her uncle had signed the deed over to her before moving to live with his daughter in Omaha. She had never intended to run a general store. She had intended to teach school. But the store had become hers, the town had become hers, and the life she'd built inside it had the kind of quiet weight to it that you don't walk away from without thinking hard first. She should have said no.
She thought about it later.
How there was a version of that morning where she handed him his change and he walked back out the door, and she went on with her inventory and none of it ever happened. A clean, simple version.
She'd had those before. They never seemed to be the ones that stuck. What she said instead was, "What's the child's name?"
He blinked. Like that wasn't the question he'd expected. "Tansy," he said, "and she's 7-8 in March."
Della looked at him for a long moment. What does she like? Something shifted in his face. Just barely. "Birds," he said. "She draws them. On whatever paper she can find." Della untied her apron, folded it over the counter, and said, "I need 2 days to arrange for someone to mind the store, and I want to meet her before I agree to anything permanent." Stellan stared at her. "I said day after tomorrow. Then you'd better come back tomorrow so we can talk terms."
He came back. She'd half expected him not to. He sat across from her at the small table she kept in the back room for doing accounts, and they talked for the better part of an hour, and by the end of it she had written out six conditions on a piece of paper and slid it across to him.
He read it without expression. Then he read it again.
The conditions were these. She would keep her name on the deed of the store, and her neighbor Gus Albers would manage it in her absence. She would receive wages, not charity. She would have her own sleeping quarters, private and separate. She would not be asked to account for her time outside of her agreed duties.
If after 30 days either of them wished to end the arrangement, they could do so without argument. And this was the one she'd written last, the one she almost crossed out. If the child didn't want her there, she would leave. Stellan set the paper down. He looked at it a moment longer. Then he said, "The last condition. Yes, that one's not yours to decide. She's a child who lost her mother," Della said. "If she looks at me and can't stand the sight of me, then there's no arrangement to speak of. Those are my terms."
He folded the paper in half and put it in his coat pocket.
"Be ready at first light,"
he said, and walked out. The road north was not what she would have called beautiful that first morning, though she came to see it differently later. It was cold and gray, and the wagon moved slowly over ground that was still hard from a freeze 2 nights before. Stellan drove and didn't say much. She watched the country change as they climbed, the flat pastured land giving way to pine and rock and a sky that seemed to press down lower the higher they went. She had packed 1 trunk and a carpet bag.
She'd brought her own pillow, her sewing kit, 2 good aprons,
and a copy of a bird identification book she'd found at the bottom of a box in the store's back room.
She wasn't sure why she'd packed it. She'd told herself it was for the child. She suspected it was for herself.
Tansy was waiting on the porch when they arrived. She was small for 8, with her father's dark coloring and eyes that were watching Della from across the yard before the wagon had even stopped. She didn't come forward. She didn't run away either.
She just stood there in a coat that was slightly too big for her, arms at her sides, assessing.
Della climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help, brushed the dust from her skirt, and walked toward the porch at a pace that wasn't hurried. "You must be Tansy," she said when she was close enough. The girl looked at her, said nothing.
"My name is Della. I've come to help out around the place for a while. Still nothing. Your father tells me you draw birds." Something moved in the girl's eyes. Caution, mostly. But underneath it, just a flicker of something else.
Della reached into her carpet bag and produced the bird book.
I found this in my store. I don't know much about birds myself, but I thought maybe you could teach me. Tansy looked at the book, looked at Della, looked at the book again. She didn't take it, but she didn't walk away. That was the beginning.
The house was larger than Della had expected. 4 rooms downstairs, 2 up, built by a man who'd planned for more than he got. It was clean in the way of a place kept by someone who didn't have enough hours in the day and made deliberate choices about what mattered. The kitchen was functional and well-stocked.
The floors had been swept. The windows let in good light. What it lacked was warmth, not temperature. Stellan kept a proper fire.
The other kind. The kind that comes from voices at a table and a dog underfoot and the smell of something good on this before anyone's hungry yet.
Della set to work. She didn't make any speeches about it. She didn't announce changes or ask for permission. She simply began doing things. She baked bread the first morning
and left a half loaf on the counter for whenever anyone wanted it. She fixed the hinge on the pantry door that had been catching. She moved the kitchen table 18 inches to the left so the afternoon light came in over it at a better angle, and when Stellan came in for supper and noticed, he didn't say a word, just pulled out his chair and sat down. Tansy watched all of this from doorways, mostly. She had a habit of appearing in thresholds without making noise, present but uncommitted, like a cat deciding whether a room was worth entering. On the third day, Della set out 2 cups of tea in the afternoon, one at her usual spot and one across from her, and then she opened the bird book and began reading to herself, out loud, in a voice just loud enough to carry.
On the 4th day, Tansy came and sat across from her. She didn't touch the tea. She didn't speak.
But she pulled the book around so she could see the illustrations, and her fingers hovered over the page the way a child's will when they're trying very hard not to show how much they want something.
That one, Della said, pointing to a mountain bluebird. I've seen out near the ridge in summer. The blue is almost unbelievable, like someone painted it.
Tansy looked at the picture for a long time. Then she got up and went upstairs and came back with a folded piece of paper, which she smoothed out on the table and set next to the book. It was a drawing.
Pencil, careful and detailed, of a bird Della didn't recognize. What is it? Della asked.
Tansy's voice, when it came, was quiet and a little hoarse, like something she hadn't used in a while. Pine siskin, she said. There's one that comes to the south window.
Della looked at the drawing. It was good.
Genuinely good, with an attention to the feathers and the tilt of the head that most adults wouldn't have thought to notice.
You've got a real eye, Della said.
Tansy took the drawing back and smoothed it twice more, and then she went upstairs again. But the next morning she came down for breakfast and sat at the table without being called, and she answered when Della asked her how she took her oatmeal. Stellan was harder. He was not unkind. She wanted to be fair about that.
He fed his animals well and paid his workers what he owed them, and he never raised his voice in the house. But there was a distance to him that went beyond shyness or reserve, a deliberate space he kept between himself and anything that might ask something of him. She noticed it in small ways.
He would come in for a meal and eat it without comment, even when she'd made something that took effort. He answered questions with the minimum number of words required.
When she asked, one evening, whether there was anything particular he'd like her to prepare for the following week, he said, "Whatever you think is fine," and looked back at the paper he was reading. She let it go the first time, and the second.
On the third occasion, she set down the dish she was washing, dried her hands, and said, "I'm going to need more to work with than that."
He looked up. "I mean it practically," she said. "I don't know what you like, what the child can't eat, what days the men come in and need feeding."
"I'm not asking you to have a conversation. I'm asking you to give me information so I can do my job." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. Then he set down his paper and told her. Tansy couldn't eat eggs without getting sick, though she'd eat them in baked things. The ranch hands came in on Wednesdays for a midday meal. He preferred coffee to tea, always, and he couldn't stomach parsnips, which his mother had fed him every winter of his childhood, and which he had resolved, upon leaving home, never to eat again. That last part he said with something that was almost humor.
Just an edge of it at the corner of his mouth.
"Noted," Della said, and went back to the dishes. But she thought about it afterward, about the parsnips, about the way a man who'd spent years reducing himself to function could still carry something that small, that specific. It made him feel more real to her than anything else had. She'd been there 6 weeks when Tansy got sick. It came on fast, the way things do with children, fine at breakfast, feverish by mid-afternoon, burning by nightfall. Stellan was out with the cattle, hours away, and the nearest doctor was the one in town, and she had no way to reach him before morning. Della had nursed her share of sick people. Her mother had been ill for 3 years before she died, and Della had learned to read the difference between a fever that needed watching and one that needed acting on. This one needed watching. She got Tansy into dry clothes, brought the fever down with cool cloths, made a broth from what she had on hand, and sat in the chair beside the bed for the better part of the night. Tansy woke around 2 in the morning and found her there.
"You stayed," she said.
Of course, Della said. The girl was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling.
"The last woman who worked here," she said. "She didn't like me. What makes you say that?"
She told me I was strange, that I needed to talk more. A pause.
"My mama used to say I just had to find the right things to say to."
Della looked at the child in the lamplight.
The bird drawings tacked to the wall, the careful dark eyes, the way she held herself even sick, like she was braced for something. "Your mama was right," Della said. Tansy turned her head and looked at her. "Do you think she can still see me, from wherever she is?" Della thought about her own mother, the way grief did and didn't get smaller with time, the way it changed shape more than it changed size.
I think, she said carefully, that people who loved us the way she loved you don't just stop. I can't tell you exactly what that looks like. But I don't think love is the kind of thing that simply disappears. Tansy didn't say anything else. But she reached out and took hold of the edge of Della's sleeve just lightly and held it for a while before she fell back asleep. Stellan came home the following afternoon to find his daughter asleep in clean sheets with a fever broken and a pot of broth on the back of the stove, and Della in the yard splitting kindling because she'd run through what was stacked by the door. He stood at the fence and watched her for a moment without speaking.
Then he said, "You didn't send for me. I knew where you were."
By the time you'd gotten here and back again, it would have been morning, and she was already improving. I would have wanted to know. She set the hatchet down.
"You're right. I should have found a way to get word to you. I'm sorry."
He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the house, and then he came forward and picked up the hatchet and finished the stack himself without being asked.
She went inside. She heard the steady rhythm of the splitting from the kitchen window for a long time afterward.
That evening he came in late, after Tansy was asleep, and found Della at the table with a cup of tea, reading. He poured himself coffee, which surprised her slightly. Usually he took it to his study. Instead, he sat down across from her at the kitchen table. She glanced up.
He said, "She talks about you." Della waited. "At supper, when I'm home, she talks about what you made and what you showed her." He looked at his coffee. "She doesn't talk about much. Hasn't for a while."
A pause. I didn't know how to reach her after her mother. I kept thinking I'd figure it out, and then time kept passing.
"She's not broken," Della said quietly. "She just lost the person she knew how to talk to. Those aren't the same thing." He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "They're not." The 30 days she'd specified in her conditions came and went without either of them mentioning it. Then 40 days, then the first frost of November, and then the first real snow. She wrote to Gus Albers every 2 weeks, and he wrote back with the store's accounts and the news from town, and occasionally with a gentle inquiry as to her plans. She wrote back practical answers. She had begun to understand that she didn't have a clear answer to give him, and she was trying to decide whether that frightened her or not. The thing was, she'd been useful before. At the store, she'd been necessary in the way that any functioning business is necessary. A service, a constant, a given. Here she was useful differently. She could feel it in the specific weight of it. The way Tansy had started leaving her drawings on the kitchen table for her to find in the morning. The way Stellan had started telling her things without being asked. What field he was moving the cattle to, whether he thought the winter would be hard, what his father had done with the land before him. She wasn't sure when the conversations had started lasting longer than they needed to. She knew when she first noticed it. It was a Sunday in November when the snow had kept everyone inside, and Tansy had fallen asleep in the sitting room after lunch with the bird book open across her chest. And Della and Stellan had sat on either side of the fireplace for 2 hours, talking about things that had nothing to do with the ranch or the weather or the practical business of the house. His mother had been a school teacher. She'd grown up in western Kansas. He'd wanted to study engineering once, before the land came to him. She'd wanted to travel before she hadn't. At some point he'd said, "Do you miss the store?" She'd thought about it honestly. "I miss knowing what I was," she said. "I knew what I was there. And here?" She looked at the fire. "I'm still working that out." He nodded, like that was an answer he understood. It was Tansy who made things complicated, in the way that children always do, by saying the honest thing at the wrong moment. It was a Wednesday in December, and the ranch hands had come in for their midday meal, and one of them, a young man named Purvis, who had never quite learned what to do with his eyes, made a comment about Della that was just a shade past what was acceptable. Nothing severe, the kind of thing a man says when he thinks he's being charming and hasn't figured out the difference. Stellan was at the other end of the table. He heard it. He didn't raise his voice. He just said the man's name, once in a certain tone. And the table went quiet, and Purvis found somewhere else to look, and the meal continued.
Afterward, when the men had gone and Tansy was helping clear the plates, she said conversationally, as if continuing a thought she'd been having,
Papa doesn't let anybody talk about Della that way.
Della kept her hands busy.
He told Amos Greer the same thing last month, Tansy continued. When Amos said it was strange that you were staying so long, Tansy, Stellan said.
I'm just saying what happened. I know what happened. Tansy stacked 2 plates, looked between them with the calm clarity that children sometimes have when they're watching adults fail to say something obvious, and carried the dishes to the kitchen.
Della finished wiping down the table. She could feel him standing near the window.
She's not wrong, he said finally. She didn't answer right away. I'm not sure what to do with that, she said. Honest, because she'd found with him that honesty was the thing that worked.
I don't have a simple answer either.
He turned from the window.
But I want you to know, whatever you decide, it wasn't only practical. From the beginning, it wasn't only practical.
She thought about the night she'd sat with Tansy, the morning she'd come down to find him already at the kitchen table, reading, and how she'd made 2 cups of coffee without thinking about it. The way she'd started sleeping better here than she had in years, in that room under the eaves with the pine siskin that came to the window. I know, she said. She went back to town in January, not permanently. She'd said she needed a week to deal with the store's accounts properly, to have a conversation with Gus, to sort out what her intentions were before she made any of them official.
She'd been vague on purpose and she knew it, and she thought Stellan knew it too, but he helped her pack the wagon and said to send word if she needed anything, and watched her go without asking for more than she was ready to give. Gus Albers met her at the door of the store like he'd been waiting, which she suspected he had. Well, he said. Well, she said. You look different. I've been out more. He gave her a long look. You want to sell the store, don't you? She'd thought about it the whole drive down. She'd thought she'd feel relief when she said it out loud, or regret, or some sharp, clear emotion to tell her which way to go. Instead, she felt something quieter. Like the feeling of setting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. I want to think about it, she said. But yes, I think I do.
Gus nodded slowly.
I'll tell you what it's worth, he said, and you tell me when you're ready.
She stayed 4 days. She walked through the store and the rooms above it, where she'd lived since her uncle left. She ate at the cafe where she'd eaten 100 lunches. She had tea with her neighbor Irene Poole and listened to the news of town and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was visiting, that she had become someone for whom this was a place she was visiting.
On the 4th day, she sat down and wrote a letter to Stellan.
Not a love letter. She wasn't ready for that word yet, wasn't sure either of them were. But a plain, honest letter, the kind she'd come to understand was the only language that worked between them. She said she was coming back. She said she wanted to talk about what came next, and she wanted to talk about it plainly, without either of them pretending it was simpler than it was. She said that Tansy should know, before anything else changed, that she was coming back because she wanted to, not because she was obligated to, and that the difference mattered. She sent the letter with the afternoon post. She left the following morning. It was snowing when she came up the ridge road, the sky white and low, the pines heavy with it, the kind of snow that muffles everything and makes the world feel private. Tansy was at the window when the wagon came through the gate.
Della saw her there,
a small dark shape against the glass, and then the shape disappeared and the front door opened before she'd even tied off the horse. The girl came across the yard in her coat, and her boots and her hat that was always slightly crooked, and she stopped a few feet away and looked up at Della with those careful, watching eyes.
You came back, she said. I said I would.
Tansy was quiet for a moment, the way she went quiet when she was deciding about something important.
The pine siskin came back too, she said finally, to the south window, this morning. Della looked at her. Is that so? I drew it again. I thought you'd want to see. I would, Della said. Very much.
Tansy reached up and took her hand, briefly and without ceremony, the way a child does when they've decided something, and then let go and walked back toward the house. Stellan was standing in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, watching. He didn't say anything when she came up the steps. He just moved aside to let her in. She came through the door, and the house was warm, and there was coffee on the stove, and on the kitchen table was Tansy's drawing, the siskin, careful and exact, each feather placed just so. Some things don't announce themselves.
They don't arrive with speeches or certainty or a clean moment you can point to later and say, there, that was when. They simply accumulate quietly, the way a season changes, not in a single day,
but in the days, until one morning you look up and realize that what you're standing in is nothing like what you left, and you cannot imagine going back, and you find that you don't want to. Della hung her coat on the hook by the door, her hook, the one she'd started using in October, and turned toward the kitchen and began.